Welcome to the Edw Friday. My name is Michael Olschimke. I'm the CEO of Scalefree. We run the session here every Friday, 11 o'clock Central European Standard Time, to allow you, the audience, to ask questions. And yeah, everything, well, not everything's allowed, but all data vault related or data-driven questions are allowed. Everything around data vault, big data, cloud computing, everything will be fine. If you want to raise a question in live, use the chat here, use the Q&A, any means what you prefer. Essentially, you can raise your hand if you want, or you can use a form which I show you after today's session. Well, I show you the link to the form. If you receive multiple questions, I would cherry pick, which I've done today. And I'm working on the open questions at the moment, and it's time box, so we're looking at 10 minutes for roughly 10 minutes for an answer. And if there would be no questions at all, I will talk about the cluster. I did once or twice already, so I'm not sure if the recordings ended up on YouTube, but we'll see. Okay, so we received a question. Let me just show it to you guys. 1 second. I have to, one. There you go. All right, so this is about environments in an enterprise database setting. When this person here, or this individual here, is working in a project where they have 3 environments: development, production, test, but they're not well administrated. So they have them, but they're not in sync, as far as I understand this question. So it's not mentioned. Yes, I think it's not in the book either. Could you please elaborate on the roles of these environments and how to correctly use and manage them? As context, the problem faced at the moment by the company is that they're not being able to test correctly and then implement. Also, the environments don't necessarily count with the same information. All right, so here's the thing. Let me open up my whiteboard here. Share my content, whiteboards. I prepared this. Okay. So typically, when customers start a project with less than 3 environments, I personally walk out. Backwards, essentially, right? And that's what I would suggest to you as well. 3 environments is the minimum you need, in my opinion, for any IT-driven project, not just a data warehouse project. But 3 environments, and the ones you suggested here are essentially a dev environment, a test environment, and a production environment. And I'll come back to that. I might want to add more environments than that, but we'll talk about this. So the idea is, and we'll see some limitations here, that you as a developer, you develop in the development environment here. You're here essentially, and then you would use the test environment for integration testing. Most clients, or many clients, they have a development environment on the local machines where the developers develop, or they have a centralized development environment where all the developers work together essentially in the same environment. One way or the other, both works. It's just how you work in these environments is a little bit different. That's it. But then the integration test, especially if you don't work in a centralized development environment, you would use the test environment for integration testing. That's super important then. But even if you work in a centralized development environment, the problem is every developer has their own state of the code essentially, and you want to deploy some part of the code into the next layer essentially, or in the next environment actually. And that's where the test environment comes in. That's really for integration testing. Does everything work as intended, essentially? And then at the end of the sprint, you have the UAT, the user acceptance test, where you want to demonstrate essentially the functionality to the client, to the user, product owner, whoever, and they should accept the functionalities based on the requirements, essentially. And that's where you also use the test environment. And now it depends a bit on what kind of tool stack you use. For example, if you're in a cloud, you would spin up quickly a copy of the production environment for UAT testing. That's the best approach. You only need it for the end of the sprint. Once the functionality has been accepted, you can get rid of the UAT environment again. In the worst case, in a minimal case, you're using the test environment for this. I mean, you deployed already everything is integrated. So you would demonstrate what you have in test environment now towards the end of the sprint. You would demonstrate that to the product owner. If they accept it, you would then deploy everything into production. That's a theory. Problem is, it would be easier if we could essentially separate the test environment from the UAT case. I mean, the integration test environment from the UAT case, which brings us to four environments. So in not my preference yet, but a better setup would be if you have a dev environment, you have a integration test environment, you have a UAT environment, and a production environment. And then I would draw a red line here. Essentially, it says the developers who stay on the left side of the red line, they stay on the left side. So you as a developer, you develop in the development environment, you perform the integration tests in the integration test environment. And then when you feel ready towards the end of the sprint, you would then deploy everything into the UAT environment. I mean, you prepare a deployment, let's assume manually. You would set the deployment, describe what needs to be deployed and when and how, set up the deployment. So you would deploy this as a package, as a first test into the UAT environment. Once it's accepted by the end users, by the product users, product owners, the same setup, the same deployment procedure would then be used to execute everything into production. That's the basic idea. The thing is, the difference on the right side of the red line is that's where the business stays. That's where you have the business side. That's the developers. And on the right side, you typically have real data, real production data. So you create a copy of the production environment into UAT. While on the left side, you typically have anonymized data, test data, some artificial data essentially that you work with, or reduced data for privacy reasons or security reasons. So on the left side, you only have development data, that's it, but no real data. You don't see all the data. That's on the left side. No business user is supposed to cross the red line, and no developer is supposed to cross the red line from the left to the right, right? So that's the idea. That also answers where we have real data, real production data on the right side of the red line, and where we have the test data essentially. Now in the cloud, you can spin up these environments to a good extent. So you can quickly create a copy of the production environment and spin it up as a UAT environment. Once you're done with the UAT, you get rid of the environment again. So it looks always expensive, but it's actually not. So what you need to have running is a production environment for sure. There might be even more production environments. So I'm looking at this from a development standpoint or project standpoint, but there might be requirements from an organization why you have multiple production environments, or why they have a test environment for the deployment, that kind of stuff. So, right. So there might be multiple environments here for testing the deployment, for having multiple production environments, and so on. That's all out of my scope or out of our scope. So from our perspective, that's what we're looking at. I don't care for this part here. All right, so that's the idea. So spin up the UAT when you need it and get rid of it once you're done with the UAT. Once everything has been accepted, you can get rid of UAT and just deploy everything into production essentially. Integration tests sometimes as well. Typically, most projects have the development, test, and production environment running all the time, and UAT on demand. That's how it typically works. And then, in the best case, from a Datable project, I would like to have a fifth environment essentially, and that is a regression test environment where you do regression tests. And when you know regression tests, let's say some of you might know JUnit or NUnit from Java or C# development. And you can find similar concepts in SQL databases. There's something like in Oracle, you find Aura test or something, or Aura unit, or PG unit, PL unit, I think. In Postgres, you will find PG unit, PG tab, those approaches. You will find similar stuff on SQL Server and so on. And so I would like to have some unit tests essentially, which I can run on a regular basis just to see if my code is still stable, if maybe an error pops up again that I've already fixed last time and so on, right? Because I was a software developer before I start my data journey. And in software development, there's some simple practices. So for example, when there's a bug report coming in for a bug in your software package, before you fix the bug, the first thing you do is you create a test case for the bug to prove the bug exists, fix the bug, and then use the test case to prove that the bug doesn't exist anymore. And that test is then added to the regression test library. So you just to make sure that this bug that happens once will not occur again in the future. That's what is. So you build your regression test library over time, essentially, based on the bug reports. Plus, when you go for test-driven development, when you develop some new code, you're supposed to develop the test case first, develop the code, and so on, right? So those practices I was missing all the time from data warehousing. I mean, traditional data warehousing, before I understood how Data Vault works. Now, when you want to have a regression test in Data Vault, there's a couple of components that we need to have for a unit test. One is the unit to be tested. That's number one, right? So what do we want to test? In Data Vault, it's quite simple. You want to test business logic. And business logic is in a business vault, typically. Well, there could be also information about entities, right? We have business logic. But let's say most of the business, it doesn't really matter. So you can test both the business vault, and you want to test the business vault and the information about entities. That's a unit to be tested. Then in a unit test, let's say JUnit, I'm calling the test case essentially with some example data, which I stabilize. I know the input for the test call, and I have an expected outcome. What is the return from the function, essentially, from the method? And then I see the actual outcome, the actual return from the function. So the expected outcome would be if you let's say have a business vault entity, you just query it, that's the actual outcome, what's really coming back from the business vault entity. And then you could have a side table, a table with the same structure as the business vault entity, just a table, not a view this time, just a table with where you store the expected outcome. And then you just compare the expected outcome with in your side table with the actual outcome from the business vault entity. But the problem is the input changes all the time, right? Because you're loading data into your production environment all the time. And you're loading data all the time, and the data is not stable. The input is not stable. The input for your test case is not stable. That's the problem we're facing. Well, and we can solve that. The thing is this: if you go insert only incremental in a Data Vault approach, which we typically do, well, I mean, that's what you want to do. If you go insert only incremental from a loading perspective, we have a stable environment. We have a stable data set until a certain load date timestamp. Until a given fixed load date timestamp, I can guarantee the data is stable. Because if you insert only and incremental only, then you will only add new data over time, right? But that will be added to a later load date timestamp. So, and that's the idea now. What we're doing is, in the loading procedures for this regression test environment, I need this environment to stabilize my input for my unit tests. So I'm loading data from production in here until a given load date timestamp. So I'm filtering, and the load date timestamp is fixed. You just use some value that you have as a constant defined, essentially. Birthday of your wife or husband, I don't know. Maybe you find some better times that you can explain to your managers and customers. But so what we do is we copy essentially the raw data vault until this load date timestamp. All the entities in automated fashion, all the entities from the raw data vault, you just copy into this environment essentially, but filter the data until the load data timestamp, the fixed one. And then you would deploy the business vault entities. Those come from your deployment package. So somewhere they will add essentially from here. That's the BV. Depends a bit on how you set up the environments, but either from here or you also get them from production environment. And what you have to have is the test cases, which you can generate. The test cases for the unit test, the expected outcome, that's what you essentially deploy into production as well. And then when you run the script, when you run all these test cases, you have returns, right? You get essentially feedback is the actual result the same as the expected result, using a minus statement essentially. If it's the same, well, if it's not the same, then you would fail the test, and you have some feedback for the developers essentially. That's what you return. No data, right? So you only, because you're looking at actual data down here in the regression environment, the developers can only deploy the test cases, and they can retrieve the results from the test case. That's it. But you need to make sure there's no data shown in the test case, essentially. All right. And what we also typically do is in these environments, when loading the raw data vault from the production environment, you might also want to consider sometimes extreme values. Let's say your setup is designed in a way that you are allowing, I don't know, you want to make sure that negative ages are processed in the correct way, whatever the business rule says, right? But you don't have negative ages in your data, in your actual data from production, because everybody has a positive data, a positive age. In this case, you would also add the extreme cases, which are valid cases, extreme cases to your data in this process here. Plus, okay, but stencil went down. Ah, damn it. Yeah, I was just loading it. So when you load the raw data vaults until a given load data stamp, you also add the extreme cases to the loading procedures, and then your test checks for the correctness of the processing transformation of those extreme cases as well. That's the idea, and that's my preferred or desired environment. Having 5 environments. The regression test environment you could also spin up once in a while, overnight, for example, right, or before deployment, whatever. Would also work. It's just a little bit of loading because you need to load the data until the load date, and that takes some time, right? So you could also keep it running, and then you have the existing data vault entities are preloaded, and you only need to load the new data vault entities into the regression test environment, load the data at the extreme values, deploy the tests, run the tests, send back the results from the test. Essentially, that's the idea. Yeah, that's my prep. That's my paradise for data vault. All right, but with 3 environments I could work. So 3 environments is good enough, but below 3, if you have less than 3 environments, I would really suggest I mean, you have to solve this problem, right? Either if the customer solves it, if they can't or don't want to solve this, then it's not a good case for a project, to be honest. All right, cool, but good question. Yes. Let me just share my screen again. All right. Cool. So that's the answer here. Again, 3 environments. It depends again where what your tool stack is. Are you in the cloud or not? You can spin up the UAT environment, which I would like to have. You could spin it up on demand. Because there's some comments here again when I reread this again. So for the test environment, so it also depends. Can you see actual data or not? I assume not, because from a GDPR perspective, the development environment should be anonymized. You can't argue typically, well, you can, but it's ask the lawyers. So ask your lawyers. If the requirement is that developers cannot use actual data, which I would assume, in this case, we want to anonymize the data somehow from production to development environment. There's tools out there which you can use. We have customers where they build some scripts, how they anonymize the data downstream. Think about this. In Data Vault, when you split your satellites into personal satellites and non-personal satellites, you could assume the non-personal satellites don't contain any personal data, so you can load those. And you only need to do something here for the personal satellites, for example. So that could give you some input for a custom-built script. Test environments, same game. If developers are working with a test environment, you cannot argue there should be production data in it. On the other hand, for UAT testing, you want to see production data. So that's where you would see 4 environments having a better value for you. But if you're limited to 3, I would anonymize the data for the test environment. Focus on the integration test first of all, and then try to spin up a UAT environment if you can. If not, you could pre-populate the data again for the UAT into the test environment just before the UAT essentially. And then use the freshly populated UAT test environment, right, for testing the deployment first. Once that works, UAT works, then you deploy it into production essentially. So you have to, I would use the test environment now for 2 purposes, for integration test and UAT, and spin it up reload it all the time. And what I would do is I would synchronize, because the problem is now, what a lot of projects do is they have this development environment, and you have your developers working on this environment, and they get out of sync sooner or later. Well, what I would suggest is you recreate the development environment and the test environment on a regular basis. For example, you could argue at the sprint end, the test environment, I mean, everything that's not deployed from testing into production, well, we have to recreate a test environment. So why don't you just create a new test environment at the sprint end when you're done? Or when you, let's say, when you're done with the features for a sprint, let's say you have a 4-week sprint, after 3 weeks, you're done with all the features, and then comes the preparation of the deployment, the documentation, and so on. So after 3 weeks, for the first 3 weeks, you can use the test environment for integration testing. After 3 weeks, you prepare the UAT environment in this database. And then once you're done with that, with the UAT, preparing means you recreate the test environment with production data now. And then once you're done with that, once you're done with the UAT, deployed everything, you recreate the test environment again with anonymized data for the developers and so on. That's one approach. On the other hand, to be honest, 4 environments is not a big deal. So it's just one more database in the opinion, right? So, all right. So do it on a regular basis. So the developers are used to the fact that after 4 weeks, the test environment is fresh again. Every 4 weeks, you refresh the test environment. And for development environment, something similar, maybe not so often, but also you could argue, have it on a regular basis. Your developers get used to it. That's what it is. So if the code is relevant still for you as a developer, you have to have a backup. You have to have it checked in actually in the branch of your Git, right? So otherwise the code is not relevant anyway. So that's what you could argue. And then if you really follow this practice, synchronize these environments on a regular basis. That's what I would suggest. And find a good point in time or point in your sprint actually when you refresh these environments. Or what is the reason why when you refresh it essentially? All right, cool. Good question. Yeah, okay, perfect. So if you have a question like this, post it here on the behind this URL here, https://sfr.ee/dbfriday. That's where you find a form where you can upload the question, upload maybe some images of your whiteboard or diagram or team picture, whatever it is. All great. Everything you upload might be published here, so be aware of that one. Have your haircut in shape, right? Not as me today. Also check out our other webinars at scalefree.to and webinars. There's a webinar on DBT and a webinar on Warescape that I highly recommend to you to check out. Also, the other thing is we have the data dreamland coming up in October, on October 10 and 11. That's essentially a conference, our conference in Hanover, where our customers speak and present the projects we've done with them, where vendors come over. We just announced VaultSpeed as a sponsor, Coalesce as a sponsor. They will demonstrate the new features in the tool. There are some certain particular vendors where they have some very interesting new features this year. And yeah, I would strongly recommend to check out if you can make it on October 10th and 11th to Hanover. And then we can shake hands for real, not just here virtually here. It's not as good as in real. Okay, cool. And yeah, thanks for joining. I hope you enjoyed today's session. So a bit longer today, but I think it was worth it. And wish you a nice weekend and see you hopefully next Friday. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining today. If you'd like to discuss this further, give us a call on the number below here, and we're happy to discuss this with you. See you next time. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.